Hey guys, this is Loman02 doing my second video of the day. We're actually be covering the pre-modern format, which is the end of 94 all the way through 2003. So basically, or I believe 7th edition. So basically what this format includes are any cards that have the old borders on them. As much as possible, I've tried to include old borders in this card set, even to include some white bordered 7th edition brushlands and Carpusan forests. Not that I don't have the ones with black borders as much as I would love to play them, but I actually love the white borders, as it reminds me of Revised Unlimited. And they're just great trolling cards. But that all aside, the format is kind of like old school light, and actually I tend to think you can get better gameplay in this format, or at least more diverse gameplay with a wider set of cards than you even do in old school, which is actually pretty amazing, because I think old school is actually a very wide format. What I'm going to do is run you through a deck tech here. This is actually one of the more fun decks that I played in this format. This is a version of Recurring Nightmare Survival of the Fittest, also called RECSUR historically, and often associated with the card Living Death, which is another archetype of it. The heart of the deck is essentially a 4-color and could possibly go up to 5 colors if you wanted to run Traywin Rider, but basically a 4-color green X deck. The heart of which is Birds of Paradise, a lot of mana acceleration from Wall of Blossoms, Yavimaya Granger to Mana Fix. And then just a wide variety of lands to include 4 Cities of Brass that kind of help you resolve a wide variety of spells. But before we get into mana base and the creature selection for this deck, because you see there's a lot of one-off singleton cards, let's go to the engine of the deck, which is on the far left-hand side as the screen appears right now, and Squee is kind of part of this as well. So the engine of the deck is to get a Survival of the Fittest down and some number of green mana to activate Survival of the Fittest. Then you basically continue to activate Survival of the Fittest to get the creature cards that you require to continue to cast your spells and also thin your deck. So oftentimes you'll be finding stuff in the early game, like maybe a Birds of Paradise, but generally like Yavimaya Granger just to get more mana out, maybe a Wall of Blossoms to draw a little deeper into your deck, maybe a Mesmeric Fiend if you're playing against Control. Generally one of your first targets is going to be Squee, because what Squee allows you to do is just loot him to get a creature card, and then you get Squee back from your graveyard into your hand every turn, which means you can survival Squee many, many times. Oftentimes you don't need more than one Squee to get this going. If your opponent has like a Phyrexian Furnace or like a Tormod's Crypt or just graveyard hate in general, they can tend to eat him up. But in general, it's going to be still pretty good value added. Even if they do have Graveyard Hate, your opponent does, generally speaking, Graveyard Hate is not even like per se that great against the deck, because you stop it one time, but then they just run another creature and they survival into the next creature they need, and it may be an Avalanche Riders to mana screw you, maybe a Siege Gang just to beat you down, maybe an Acroma, because you can hard cast Acroma in this deck. It is possible. That's kind of one of the other cool things about the deck, is that the mana is actually quite good despite being a 4-color deck in an older format without dual lands and with only the allied fetch lands. As you see, we only play one fetch land in this entire deck, which I don't even know if it's necessary to play a fetch land. It either gets a mountain or a swamp. That's all it can do. But the engine of the deck is to use Survival. Eventually get a good card that will win you the game, or at least lock the game up. This is one possible win con. It's just like one of the biggest, best creatures from the format. It's just like a huge bomb. You generally don't want to hard cast this, but if you can cheat it in for 3 mana, then it's pretty good. Then you have other utility stuff, like all these guys, basically ETBs. Siege Gang Commander, ETBs, makes a bunch of dudes. Radiance Dragoons, and let me pull up the display panel, because these cards are old, and a lot of folks may not know them. Siege Gang, pretty simple. This card was just printed in Dominaria. Makes for 3 goblins plus itself when it comes into play, so it's 5 power on the board, and you can pay a red and a 1 and sack a goblin dude, and do 2 damage to any target. Radiant Dragoons, overcosted 2/5, but it has Echo, which means it'll die on its own if you don't pay the Echo cost, but you gain 5 life when it enters. And actually dying, Echo costs are not a big deal in this deck, because you actually want stuff to die. Avalanche Riders, same thing, Echo cost, haste, 2/2, a little overcosted, a little bit beyond its time, but back in this point in time was pretty great. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target lands, so it has some, Ponza kind of action going on. Bone Shredder, only one of these in the deck, comes into play, has Echo again. When it comes into play, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature, pretty great. Utabi Orangutan, this card right here, blows up any artifact when it comes into play. We play no artifacts in this deck, so there's really no risk of blowing up your own artifacts. But if your opponent has one, use survival, because survival, what it basically says is discard a creature card, search your library for any creature card, and then put it in your hand, and then shuffle your library. So having a lot of one-offs in a survival-based deck is actually quite powerful. So if you have my Granger, which is kind of like an earlier and generally worse Wood Elves, but this can find any basic land card. It does come into play tapped. But it can find any land card. So we have a litany of basics in the deck to include a mountain, plain, swamp, a bunch of forests. It just finds one of those, puts into play tapped, ramps you up a little bit, thins your deck out. And then on the next turn has Echo Cost, and generally speaking, you don't generally pay it, but sometimes you do. Wall Blossoms, very simple card, very good against aggro. 0/4, Defender, comes into play, cycles itself, gets you another card. Great. Also great to just ditch with a Survival of the Fittest. Mesmeric Fiend comes into play, exile a card from opponent's hand. When it dies, that card goes back. Monk Realist, 2 mana, 1/1, but when it comes into play, destroy target enchantment, which is just another removal spell for a permanent type in the game. Then you have your mana dudes right here. So you have Birds of Paradise, which are kind of like the core of the Green X decks from all the way back in the ABU times up until, whenever it's in a printed cycle, it tends to see play. Maybe not now with Goblin Chainwhirler, but who knows. Well of Roots, just a simple 0/5, also very good against aggro. Makes a bunch of mana. Pretty strong card. Akroma, one of the few creature cards in the deck, including it and Squeed, that does not have an ETB, but is just a beast. Like, her purple hair, purple sash, angelic form. Comes in, has haste, protection from, two of the colors of magic, trample, vigilance, first strike, flying, haste. It's just every pro word you could possibly put on. I never even read the text on this thing. It's been a while. No rest, no mercy, no matter what. That's pretty true, at least in this format, from what I found. This card is quite the beating against certain decks. So, going back to the core, using survival to basically find a bunch of utility toolbox-type creatures to deal with the answers and solutions your opponents come up with, and eventually win the game. And then a lot of these creatures, after they've already been put into play, because they're kind of like spells in a lot of ways, like you could look at Utabi Orangutans as a slightly overcosted naturalize, well, a much worse naturalize, but sort of like a naturalize. Same thing with Monk Realist. It could be looked at as like a more expensive erase. Yavimaya Granger, kind of a more expensive rampant growth. Actually, be better to call it Farseek, but it can actually get a forest. Radiance Dragoons, like a really overcosted Gather the Feast, or whatever that card is, the 2-mana green spell that gains you 5 but doesn't put a creature into play. So basically all of these cards will end up putting a body into play, and sometimes you'll be blocking with them, sometimes you'll be attacking with them, but generally speaking you want them to die again so that you can use Recurring Nightmare to continually use your creature cards as spells. That's why Echo actually, is generally not seen as a liability in this deck, because if your creature cards die, it's fine. You'll just go ahead and Recurring Nightmare them. And then if it gets to the really late game, you can just use Living Death and bring back a boatload of enters the battlefield effects creatures, and generally just wipe your opponent out. So, Living Death, if you're not familiar, sacrifice or exile all the creatures, then sacrifice all the creatures they control. Exiles all the creatures from their graveyard, then sacrifices all the creatures they control, then puts all cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. So, quite powerful. Kind of like an upgrade to Patriarch's Bidding from the Goblin Bidding deck of yore. So mana base, 1 Brushland, 4 Carpoolson Forest, 4 Llanowar Waste, red mana, and red-green. It's basically a Jund deck, a base Jund deck. Is the most important. Also 4 Cities of Brass, 3 Forests, 1 Mountain, 1 Plains, 3 Swamps, base rock, but Jund is also important because you have the Siege Gang, which you may need to hardcast. You also have the 4 Avalanche Riders, which are kind of at the core of the deck to kind of slowly allow you to use Grangers to build up your mana base while you deplete your opponent's mana base. And just grind them out. So it's a very grindy, more of actually, like, oddly enough, I think it's more of a controlling deck. Like a board control deck, as opposed to like a mid-range deck, which is kind of odd, but it does have like the combo flourish with Living Death and then like Recurring Nightmare to continue to do that. But typically speaking, you're just trying to control the board and then eventually win with some nonsense like a Chroma, or if she gets exiled by Path to Exile or something like that, or I'm sorry, not Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshare or something like that, then eventually you just win with like 2/2s and nonsense like that. Sideboard. So we have some additional creature options. We have an Elvish Lyricist, which kind of backs up the Monk Realist plan in case someone removes a card from your graveyard or your deck. An additional Utabi Orangutan. Sometimes it's best to have 2 copies of a single type of creature. because it allows you to be more efficient with your recurring nightmare activities. So if you only have one of a certain type of creature, you have to recurring nightmare twice to loop back to it. Whereas if you have two of them, you can loop them continuously. So for each recurring nightmare, I can do 2 Octavia orangutans. So I'm playing against like, not a workshops deck, but a deck that's like all artifacts. Or, in the instance of like Monk Realist, Elvish Lyricist, I can cycle these 2 back and forth if I need to deal with a lot of enchantments. There's probably like an Enchantress deck in this format. Mog Fanatic I actually really like because this dude's really good at dealing with little creatures. Bone Shredder's very good at dealing with a lot of creatures that are not black or artifacts, but Mog Fanatic can be cycled to deal with a bunch of tiny little dudes like Jackal Pups, like, goblins. There's a lot of like speed aggro decks, and he deals very well with a lot of them. So I think he's kind of a cool sideboard card. Another Radiance Dragoon. Against certain decks like Sly, they're just going to try to life you really fast. If you get 2 of these things in your deck, get one of them on the board, one of them in your graveyard, and have a recurring nightmare, you can just gain so much life, there's no way they can ever beat you. Same can be said of Worship. There's a lot of decks that are singularly focused on depleting your life total and cannot interact with permanents very well that are not creatures or the opponent's face. Worship makes it very difficult for certain decks like Sly or like Suicide Black is going to have a very difficult time dealing with Worship. I think the only way they could really deal with it is like a card like Perish. And then the rest of the sideboard is really focused on beating control. So you have 4 Duresses right here. Choke, Pyroblast, 2 Boils, another Mesmeric Fiend to top it out at 4 Mesmeric Fiends, and like a Dwarven Blastbinder, which is good in the control matchups and is also pretty decent against like the 3 and 4 and 5 color. It's not bad in the mirror, like those kind of decks. Like the mirror match is not horrendous, although we also have a lot of mana producers, and so would any opposing deck that is in the mirror. So this is Toolbox RECSUR, very very fun deck. I'm gonna go ahead and go on a quick pause, guys, and then I'm gonna jump into some gameplay so you can kind of see how this deck plays out. Alright guys, so we're back. This is the opening hand we have with our RECSUR list. This is a very acceptable hand, so we have a turn 1 Birds of Paradise, and, depending on what we draw, up next turn we can very easily play a Yavimaya Granger. We're playing against Jordan of Cardboard Confrontation, aka Magic Stronghold on MTGO. This hand's quite good, so it's going to ramp itself pretty fast, and then we have a lot of directions we can go. We can either blow up lands, we can Radiance Dragoon to gain some life. We don't really have an engine card in this hand, so we don't have the Survival or the Recurring Nightmare, but there's always draw steps, and this hand seems good enough just to open on. I do have the play here, so I go ahead and lead on my Brushland, play my birds out, and say go. Opponent plays for Schadenport, but nothing else. I feel pretty comfortable with that. I just go ahead and get the Granger down this turn, because if I draw a land on the following turn, I'll be able to play Wall of Blossoms plus possibly like a Mez Fiend. And I think I want to just develop my mana base and increase the likelihood of top decking well. I do not pay the echo cost on this gentleman here. I go ahead and let him die. Opponent accidentally taps their own land, which is rough. I do try to go for a draw here. I find a Recurring Nightmare, which is a good pickup. I go ahead and Mesmeric Fiend. And let's go ahead and pause here momentarily. So my opponent's hand, he's playing Goblin Bidding. I thought in the beginning he may have been playing Sly. The way Goblin Bidding works, this is Patriarch's Bidding. It says you name each player names a creature type. Each player returns all creatures of the chosen type from their graveyard to the battlefield, which is kind of like Living Death Light. It does not deal with the board as it sits, but it does bring back decks that have homogeneous creature types, brings back a significant amount of value. So Goblins is going to be a much more difficult matchup than Sly would have been, because Goblins can actually accrue card advantage pretty rapidly through cards like Goblin Ringleader. They have a bunch of Cyclers. They have Patriarch's Bidding to kind of do everything they've been doing over again. So the deck actually is a little bit tougher, I think, for this deck to face. Opponent has Wooded Foothills, fetches, does nothing, taps down my Brushland here. I go ahead and draw into a Chroma. I'm kind of lamenting that I don't have Survival right now, because a Chroma becomes a lot better when you have Survival, because I can just Recurring Nightmare it right now. I do go ahead and get a Yavimaya Granger back. I just want to continue to develop my mana base. I'm missing a land drop this turn. Opponent does find a Goblin Sharpshooter, which is very problematic for my deck because I'm going to have a lot of creatures die. Sharpshooter, what it says is, does not untap during your untap step. Whenever a creature dies, untap Sharpshooter, tap it to deal 1 damage to any target. So it can add up very fast against a Recurring Nightmare deck because I'm actually doing a lot that involves my creatures dying to kind of get to where I need to get. Right now, my plan is to slowly, well, right now, use Recurring Nightmare as much as I possibly can. It's possible I should have just left the birds alive and gotten rid of the Granger there. But I figure my birds are probably going to die regardless to the sharpshooter on the following turn, but there's a possibility they don't kill it. Pardon me, guys. I allow my Granger to die. They untap, cycle, kill the Wall of Roots. None of this is horrendous for me because I'm going to be able to cast out an Avalanche Riders, blow up their Sulphurous Springs to take them off of mana, and then Recurring Nightmare getting back the Granger more than likely or the Wall of Blossoms. So, actually, correction, I go for Radiance Dragoons here. I don't go to Avalanche Riders them. I guess their graveyard's not that developed for using Patriarch's Bidding yet. Unfortunately, my creature types are not that homogeneous, so if they were to cast Patriarch's Bidding, I'd have to choose, and I'd probably only get 1 to 2 cards back at most. Humans are probably the most common archetype, so they go ahead and play out a Goblin Leader here, find a Lackey and another Ringleader. So, as you can tell, like they're getting ahead pretty well on cards. We're still at the same cards in hand, and I obviously have a lot more lands, so my top deck should ostensibly be better. Although I assume they run less lands, but I know that for a fact they have a Lackey and a Ringleader. The worry that I have to have now is that they're going to find a Goblin War Chief, which gives all goblins haste and makes them 1 cheaper to cast. And following that, cast out a Siege Gang Commander, which is pretty backbreaking. It's a pretty game-ending card, especially with Skirk Prospector in play, which enables them to sacrifice goblins to do damage, from the Siege Gang itself, as well as activate Sharpshooter multiple times, doing 1 damage each time they sacrifice a creature. So basically, 2 mana off Siege Gang equates to Lightning Bolts every single time, plus a hasty attack if they can find a War Leader. So that's kind of my worry here. So we take a bunch of damage, and it seems MTGO is struggling through all of these interactions. We will see if it can catch up, or I may have to restart the replay, guys. Sorry about that. Yeah, we're going to go for a quick pause, guys. I'm going to restart this and try to get back to this point in the game to kind of showcase how this game plays out. Quick pause. We'll be right back. Hey guys, Loman02 back here. It appears MTGO is working now. We're kind of close to where we were at before, so our Wall of Blossoms is finally dying here, and the Sharpshooters are doing some work to do us damage and also get through our creatures. Obviously a problem card. I probably got a little greedy. I could have gone for Mesmeric Fiend to have stopped the secondary Goblin Sharpshooter, but I kind of want to get a little deeper in the deck and see if I can find a Recurring Nightmare to find the Bone Shredder just to deal with all of these goblins, the Goblin Sharpshooters, kind of just loop it and get rid of the Sharpshooters, because Sharpshooters is going to be a problematic card against a deck that sacrifices creatures on a pretty regular basis to deal with them. Alright, so at this point, Goblin Ringleader happens, which is I think we're exactly where we ended off. Opponent finds a Ringleader plus a Lackey. Ringleader's pretty spooky. We're taking a decent bit of damage from the Sharpshooters. Find an Avalanche Riders, which is a fine pickup. I do go ahead and I believe just slam an Acroma this turn, over tapping by 1. Oops. Acroma is going to be obviously pretty hard for my opponent to deal with because it has protection from pretty much everything in their deck, unless they're running Anarchy or like maybe a Masticore with a bazillion mana for them. Although Skirk Prospector, I don't have any doubt in my mind, can make a lot of mana. So this is where the game kind of goes sideways for us. So opponent does find a Goblin War Chief. They sacrifice their 2/2. Get to Sharpshooters 4 times here, bringing us, I believe, down to 12. 11, and do a little even a little more. Find a Matron. Matron finds another Ringleader. So the Prospector's dead, but they drew another Prospector. Is based on what we saw off of the last Ringleader, and we know they have Ringleader and Prospector at a minimum in their hand. Get rid of the Sulphurous Springs because I'm a little nervous about Goblin Bidding at this point. I attack with both. Opponent allows both to go through, which is good news for me because it means they're dead on the following turn, but I very well could be dead as well. It depends on whether they have Siege Gang Commander or not. So I go ahead and I'm trying to set up a Radiance Dragoons here just to gain some additional life, to see if I can buffer my life total. Unfortunately, my opponent has another Skirk Prospector to make a bazillion mana and as a sacrifice outlet to enable the Sharpshooter. They attack with a boatload of creatures. I go ahead and block the highest power creatures, but I don't think it's relevant here. I'm just going to take a ton of damage because each creature sack is going to do essentially 2 damage. and they can also fling things at me with the Siege Gang Commander. Now I'm at 1. They sacrifice yet again, making a red mana, and put me down to 0. So sideboarding plan is pretty simple. I bring in my additional Radiance Dragoon, and I bring in Worship from the sideboard. So quick pause, guys. We'll go on to Game 2 of this match. Alright, guys, back. I mulligan the first hand because I don't really have any action. I have a Recurring Nightmare, but no creatures, no survival. This hand is much more agreeable. It's going to take a lot of damage in the early game, but it does ramp pretty fast, and it has a Recurring Nightmare to kind of accrue some value. And it also has a Bird's Paradise turn 1, which is obviously a very powerful play. It's going to allow me to Yavimaya Granger next turn to up my land count. Find a Wall of Blossoms here. I actually go ahead and play this out because I'm kind of afraid that if my opponent, has a way to deal with the Yavimaya Granger, I'm just going to have to take the damage because I'm tapping down the birds here. I do go ahead and block with the Wall of Blossoms here. They have a secondary Goblin Lackey. I play out the Granger. I believe find a swamp at this point, if I'm not mistaken. No, forest. Leave back my creatures to block because I really don't want the lackeys to get through. Skirk Prospector, which means they have a lot more mana now. I do let the Granger go ahead and die here. I actually do just play out the Uktabi Orangutan, which is still in my deck. They don't really have any artifacts that I've seen. However, I didn't really have a better sideboard option. I do leave both the 2/2s in play because it does de-incentivize attacks from my opponent unless they can remove them via Cycling Goblin. So I assume some risk there. They unfortunately do not have a Gem Palm Incinerator, or the Cycling Goblin as I like to call him. I allow Yavimaya Granger to go to the graveyard. I go ahead and cast a Recurring Nightmare, targeting, I believe, the Wall of Blossoms to draw a little deeper into the deck. Drawing another Wall of Blossoms, which is pretty solid. I'm pretty happy with that. Go ahead and get another card deep in the deck. Find a great card here. I find the Mog Fanatic, kill the Sharpshooter, because Sharpshooter is the biggest problem. And I did sideboard in the Mog Fanatic as well. That card I think is actually epically good in this matchup, and it's kind of an interesting creature to actually Recurring Nightmare. You obviously go down a creature drop every time you do it, but I think with cards like Wall of Blossoms and the Granger, our deck is going to continue to give us better and better draw steps. Do go ahead and find another Wall of Blossoms here. Find Avalanche Riders. They use the Rishadan Port to keep me off triple activation. I really don't want to take more damage than I have to here. They go ahead and play Sulfuric Vortex, which is going to limit my ability to gain life. So Radiance Dragoons has become kind of a moot card at this point. I do go ahead and allow the Yavimaya Granger to go to the graveyard. I briefly consider using Living Death here, but I think I'm just better off casting out my Avalanche Riders, blowing up their mountain to cut them off of mana, basically to turn all of their red mana into sacrifices of creatures, which is, I think, better. Getting 2 damage, I do have to start attacking here because Sulfuric Vortex can race me. I do kill their Skirk Prospector, cutting them entirely off of red mana at this point. And yes, we're losing the life race, but we are essentially getting in a shock every turn off of the Avalanche Riders. And blowing up a land. So what I do here is I Recurring Nightmare using the Birds of Paradise because I'm not really constricted on mana at this point. Get him for an attack here, and then I believe Recurring Nightmare, a Wall of Blossoms or a Granger here. I can't quite recall which one I did. Alright, I go for Yavimaya Granger because it actually does block and kill the Goblin War Chief. They do tap down one of my black mana sources, plus getting ahead on mana I think is going to be good because it allows me to Recurring Nightmare more and more as the turns go by. I do pay for my Granger this turn because I really don't. I'd rather attack with it and then transmute it into another threat. Or a Wall of Blossoms if I so desire. I do go ahead and get another Wall of Blossoms, get a card deeper, find Squee Goblin Nabob, which is fine. It's better when you have Recurring Nightmare. I do get the Avalanche Riders, blow up one of the Rishadan Ports to cut them a little further off mana. But now they're below me on life, and they're playing cards like City of Brass. They do find a Goblin Pile Driver, which I will readily block with the Avalanche Riders. Very happy to block that. They attack with both, interestingly enough. I do lose my Rangers here, or my Riders here. Draw another City of Brass. My draw has not been spectacular. I've been hitting a lot of lands, despite thinning pretty significantly. I do go ahead and Avalanche Riders away their City of Brass to cut them again off of mana. Recurring Nightmare into the Yavimaya Granger. Do it again to transmute it back into a Wall of Blossoms. Draw another land, but we're getting through the deck. Opponent doesn't have a good attack here. They're at 2 or 3. I do let this thing go to the yard. I do find a survival of the fittest, so I decide to go for the win here. I cast out Recurring Nightmare. Go ahead and get rid of this. Play the Mog Fanatic for just, I guess, lulz. I'm just being a jackass at this point. I do loot away the Squee, find a Chroma, cycle away the Chroma, find a Birds of Paradise, play Birds of Paradise, play Recurring Nightmare, bring back a Chroma, which has haste, and attack in the air for a lethal swing. And that is the end of game 2. So with a victory for us. Quick pause, guys, and we'll go on to the concluding round of this match with RECSUR versus Goblin Bidding. Alright guys, back. So this hand's interesting because it has actually like a pretty great engine in it. It has the Survival of the Fittest, which is a card that I really wanted. I draw very well and find Birds of Paradise, which means that if I'm lucky, I've already been lucky because my opponent did not play a turn 1 Goblin Lackey, which is like almost a must block or must kill. What I end up doing here is playing out Survival, leaving the Birds of Paradise untapped. They did not play a 2-drop, which in my mind means they probably have Goblin War Chief and they're trying to look for a quick win on turn 5. Play out War Chief. At this point, they can cast a Siege Gang Commander next turn. I end up survivaling for an Acroma. Go ahead and cycle the Acroma away, find just Squeeb so I can get advantage off of it. Recurring Nightmare into the Acroma, attack for 6. And the plan is to play Worship next turn. So the line of play here was to get Worship into play. And my opponent probably can't beat Worship unless they have a card like Anarchy. And if they don't, then they're just going to lose to Worship because it's probably unbeatable for their deck. Go ahead and play out Worship, and, you know, I have a 3-turn clock. They continue to hit me for life here. They play on a Siege Gang, so yes, they were going for the turn 5 win. This would have been very close to a turn 5 win here, had I not had a meaningful way to interact with it. I do go ahead and find Bone Shredder. I just get rid of, I believe, the Siege Gang. I don't think it's really that matters that much what I get rid of here. I guess it does allow them to bidding, but they're probably not going to be able to find a way to deal with the Acroma in the timetable they need to. Well, really, it's the Worship. The Acroma is not the problem, it's the Worship. Acroma they can raise because they're just so wide. Goblin's a very wide deck. They have a 13 power attacking Goblin Pile Driver, but I go down to a 2 here, 1, but they cannot go below 1 because of Worship, and I have a creature in play that they probably can't kill. So kind of like a little Mondo combo against a mostly red deck. Put them -4 and win the game with RECSUR against Goblin Bidding. So a very interesting matchup. You know, I do think that the RECSUR list is a little bit favored. I think I possibly misplayed the first game. It went for a little bit too much value, was a little bit too greedy. Another thing is, if you do get survival down, it feels very hard to lose the game because the toolbox nature of the deck, having a bunch of singletons, really comes into play. And the ability in this last game, knowing that I had survival plus Worship, and drawing into turn 1 Accelerant, you know, right on time is my 8th card being on the draw. Was exceedingly good because it's able to get a Chroma down and start damaging them, lifing them. Their plan to win via turn 5 with Siege Gang Commander off of the efficiency gained by Goblin War Leader was thwarted because of our game plan to get down Worship plus a Chroma. Chroma being unkillable, Worship likely being undestroyable as an enchantment. Makes it very difficult for their black and red deck to deal with. So we were able to kind of lock this one up, but I do think that there is a little bit of play to this matchup. I don't think it's completely lopsided, although I do think I'm a bit favored if I play to the best ability of the deck. But Goblins is kind of an interesting red deck because it actually does have a lot of ways of gaining card advantage, whether it be through Siege Gang Commander, which is just like multiple for 1 removal, or Goblin Ringleader, or Goblin Matron, which jumps generally into a Goblin Ringleader, or an essential piece of the Goblin Tron. You know, can generally do a significant bit, and you kind of got to see that in the first game where we lost, despite hard casting in a Chroma. But you kind of saw how, you know, I think if we had better keeps, or found the engine cards of our decks, this is actually the only game where I believe I actually even utilized Survival. I think the rest of them I just, you know, utilized Recurring Nightmare to just grind a bunch of value. In this game, we only had to use it once, and once was enough because Worship kind of is another powerful enchantment took over. This draw is not particularly great outside of the fact that I had worship and the ability through survival to find my my pro red, pro black lass in a chroma. But very, very cool game. I will admit that I got my ass completely kicked by Jordan in the first game while I was playing Suicide Black. I didn't include that one in here because I've already highlighted Suicide Black and kind of done a deck tech on it. And the deck is kind of more of a glass cannon. It's not a deck I'd really recommend in this format unless your metagame is exceedingly blue. But this RECSUR deck was exceedingly fun. I would very strongly recommend playing it if you like playing board control green X, 4-color green X decks that win through creatures but have a lot of play in role selection and also a lot of options for tutoring and card selection through a card like Survival of the Fittest. Great value deck. But at its heart, in my opinion, mostly a board control deck as opposed to like a creature deck. The creatures are kind of just incidental and used as spells in this deck. And you know, it's kind of one of those unfair fair decks, right? Like, you know, most of the cards in it are just pretty fair, like Yavimaya Granger, you know, Bone Shredder. But when you start complementing them with effects like Recurring Nightmare and Survival of the Fittest, you can see how the toolbox orientation of the deck can quickly become very overwhelming against most non-value based strategies that are not outright win decks like Storm or something like that. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly enjoyed playing the deck, and this is PreModern. Like I was saying in the very beginning, it's a format that encompasses all the cards post-1994, all the way through 2003, or the printing of 7th edition, basically all of the old borders. And as much as possible, I've tried to play them here, where they're available on MTGO. As you can see, the Birds of Paradise, not quite as much. But very, very sweet format. Has a lot of range and diversity to it, probably even more so than like 93, 94, which I also think is a great format, and I put up a little bit of content today. So hope you guys enjoyed the content, and hopefully we'll be doing some more PreModern here soon. Alright guys, enjoy, and take care.